Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Summer Sharif. I'm the Executive Director of Twin Cities Diversity in Practice, and thank you for joining our program today. We're really excited to have Lucas Kester and Michelle Gross here for the first in our series of programs around systemic racism in policing and community safety. Before we begin, I just wanted to cover a couple of basic webinar features so everyone can enjoy the program. If I can get the next slide, please. All attendees are on mute. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will be monitoring the Q&A and we'll be funneling the questions to our speaker. If for any reason we need to restart this webinar, please check your email for a new link. And we are recording this session for the future reference of TCDIP members and legal community members. Next slide. This series is organized by the Wanton Injustice Legal Detail, also known as WILD. And the mission of WILD is to harness the collective power of TCDIP's membership to try to remedy systemic racism and anti-Black racism in the Twin Cities community by partnering with and amplifying the work of existing community organizations. And WILD is new. It was started this summer by our emerging leaders co-chairs, who are Darnell Cage and Dadrian Graham, who after the death of George Floyd, realized that we as a legal community need to do more to address anti-Black racism in our community. I have a great deal of respect and gratitude for the work that Dadrian and Darnell have done. Program today is meant to be educational and is an opportunity for you to hear from a speaker who is doing work in this area. And our moderator is Lucas Kester, who is our ELG recruiting lead and also a lead for the group that is looking at addressing systemic racism in policing. In his spare time, Lucas is also an associate at Nichols Kester and focuses on employment litigation. And with that, I'm going to turn it, oh, just one more announcement, which is that this is a series that we are doing, and it's an educational series. And our next WILD conversation will be on the 20th of November with Tony Newborn, who is the Chief Equity Officer at the City of St. Paul. So be sure to go to our website at diversityinpractice.org to register for that program if you're interested. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lucas. Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you, Summer, and welcome to everybody. I appreciate you all jumping online this afternoon to join us in our conversation with Michelle Gross from Communities United Against Police Brutality. One of the advantages of the current situation that we're all in is that we can all have these conversations online, which allows us to all jump on from our own locales, which hopefully will encourage people to participate in these discussions. So welcome to everybody, and welcome to you, Michelle. Thank you for joining us today. I think you're on mute, actually.
Sorry about that. Yes, thank you so much for having me here.
No problem. So for everyone who's listening in today, Michelle is a retired nurse. I learned that about you yesterday as we were talking about in preparation for this, and currently work as a medical paralegal. But why we're invited you to talk with us today is because you are the president and one of the founders of an organization, Communities United Against Police Brutality, that, as I understand it, has been involved in advocating for on behalf of people who are impacted by police brutality and police misconduct for several years now. I believe it started in 2000. Is that correct?
That's correct. So we're in our 20th year.
Wow. Well, congratulations on that. And why don't we start just giving a brief sort of rundown about CUAPB. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what the organization is and how it got started and why it got started?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. So CUAPB is a little bit unique because we are actually an all-volunteer organization. We have no paid staff and never have since our beginning. And yet, despite this, we get a ton of work done. So we work in three particular areas. We provide advocacy, as you mentioned, for people dealing with the effects of police brutality. And a lot of the, so that's both people that themselves are survivors of police brutality, but also family members of people who've been killed by police. And that's a lot of the work that I do in the organization is working with those families. We maintain a 24-hour hotline. We refer people to attorneys, work with people in their cases, attend court with people, just lots of different kinds of things. We also operate a fund that helps to pay for things like independent autopsies, investigators, and so forth, to help families of people who've been killed by police, to be able to develop their cases and possibly have civil litigation. Area that we work in is a lot of work to address policy and practice issues. So we do a lot of things with city ordinances, with the police contracts, state statutes, anything that will address the underlying causes of police brutality. And then the third area that we do a ton of work in is education. So we do a lot of know your rights trainings. We're out, back before COVID, if everybody can remember those days, a little hard, starting to get harder these days, I suppose. But back before that, I swear, I think I was in schools about, different places like schools, food shelves, churches, needle exchanges, any place anybody would have us, we would be in those places doing know your rights trainings, probably 12 to 15 times a month. We were just running all over the place doing these trainings. We also have some online courses that people can take through our website and so forth. So we like to do education with people to help people understand the system, help them understand about policing and how to, advocate for their own rights and when they're in contact with police. So we just kind of do a whole lot of different things like that.
Great.
And, you mentioned how did we get started?
Yeah.
I will tell you that we got started. I think it's sort of speaks to how we have to think about policing, which is why I want to talk about this for a second. We got started in the aftermath of the Minneapolis police killing of a man named Charles Anders. And he was unarmed in his vehicle and he was gunned down. He was driving in his alleyway and gunned down 37 times behind his alleyway by Minneapolis cops. And of course, this horrified the community. And we all rushed off to, an emergency meeting. And then we were having protests and justice for Lucas Anders. And all those things were important and good things to do. But along the way, I began to think about how we've always sort of waited till something bad happened and then reacted to it. And it occurred to me that what we really needed was a group that worked 24/7, 365 on policing issues and looked at the day-to-day cases, not just those big cases of critical incidents, but really actually address the day-to-day issues that were going on, because we think that creates the climate that allows those bigger issues to happen.
Right. And you referenced obviously that the organization has been in existence now for approximately 20 years. For those of us who may not be as familiar with the organization, can you tell us a little bit about some of the things you've accomplished over the last 20 years as part of the organization?
Absolutely. We've done a lot. Like I said, a lot of it is day-to-day activities, but we've also done things like we won a class action lawsuit against the city of Minneapolis that put cameras in all the squad cars. We played an important role in the Glick v. Cunniff case, which was a case that codified the right for people to document and videotape police conduct all over the country. So that was a pretty big one. We've won a number of smaller lawsuits against municipalities around the state for primarily over data practice claims. In fact, we're in the middle of a lawsuit number 67 against the city of Minneapolis right now over data practice issues. And we need to win those. We won every other one, so we intend to win these ones as well. And it's important when you do that, because what you're doing is making sure that not only you get the data that you need to do your work, but the rest of the community can get their data as well. The city keeps trying to say that, that up means down and down means up or something, when it comes to data practice, the meaning of the statutes. And so we challenge those things. At a point, they were trying to say they didn't even have to tell us the status of police complaints, and we're saying, no, it's pretty clear from the statute and from some of the decisions like the Demis decision that in fact you do have to tell us those things. And so, we always push and advocate for that so that everybody else around us can get that data that we all want. So things like that. We do quite a bit of that.
The data you're referencing is, as I understand it, data related to police discipline and misconduct allegations, things like that, right?
Yes, all kinds of government data. We think that being the ability to access government data is a key tool for activism in all kinds of arenas. And of course, our work is in the area of police accountability. So we want to access police complaints, police policies, different other pieces of information that we need. And when the city tries to act like, we can't get that data or they just won't give it to us, then we have to litigate because we do need to push for the right to have that access to that data.
And that's one thing, as I was preparing for this conversation with you today, I obviously went through the organization's website, and one of the things that I noticed that is located on the website is you have the ability to essentially search complaints against certain officers, and that data is kind of hard to come by.
It is hard to come by.
Organization is done.
We work really hard to get that data, and again, as an all-volunteer group, it's kind of saying something to have access to it like that. That kind of data, for example, allows us to educate the community. So, for example, after Mr. Floyd was killed, in the immediate time period when he was killed, people were texting me and saying, you've got to go on Facebook and take a look at this video. And I was literally watching it as it was coming up on Facebook. And I saw the officer that was kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck. And I said, that looks like Derek Chauvin. I recognized him. I thought, I wonder if that's Derek Chauvin. Somebody was hollering out the badge numbers. In Two Tau, you could see his actual name on his uniform. But, somebody was hollering badge 947 or whatever the badge number was. And I happened to have a badge list because that's the data we get from the city. I pulled up my badge list and I said, yes, that is Derek Chauvin. Then that allowed me to pull up the records we have on Derek Chauvin and Two Tau. And within an hour and a half of that video being placed on Facebook, their whole records were up on Facebook because I put them there. And it was 3 days before the city released their names. So we told the community who they were long before, and we made sure that the community knew what these guys' records were. And they were not good records.
Sure.
So
I want to talk for a minute about the events surrounding George Floyd's killing and this summer. For any of those individuals who have joined recently, if you have questions during this discussion with Michelle, feel free to put them in the comments box on your lower right-hand corner. I'll try to get to them as we go throughout. We'll have time at the end for questions as well, but feel free to throw them in the chat box at the bottom, and I'll ask Michelle those questions as we're discussing today. So you referenced George Floyd this summer and his killing in that incident. And as someone who's been involved in this area and advocating against police brutality for now 20 years, at least 20 years, what was your personal reaction to what happened and then what happened in our city afterwards, but then also a reaction from the organization itself?
Well, of course, I got immediately busy. And honestly, from May 25th through about the end of June, I was going at it so hard that I think I slept maybe 1 to 2 to 3 hours a night. It was not an easy time period for a few reasons. One of the things that we do as an organization is having this 24-hour hotline. We have a lot of people that call in and we begin to provide them with assistance in their cases and so forth. It seemed like almost everybody I talked to for the last 20 years called me up and was contacting us because they were triggered by seeing that video. So we were really busy just dealing with all of those questions. There were lots of protests. I think during that time period there was probably 7 or 8 protests a day. And our organization works with other organizations in the Twin Cities, several organizations, and we're part of kind of a broader coalition of different groups like Racial Justice Network, Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar, and so forth, and NAACP and everybody. And so our coalitions were meeting, practically all of the leadership. We were having daily phone calls doing, holding protests later that day, trying to get a handle on what was going on. Just there was so many things happening. And the other thing we were working on is immediately putting out material on what is it that we can do to address policing in the Twin Cities. So part of it, not getting any sleep, is I remember pulling a couple of all-nighters and putting together this document, 44 recommendations to end police violence, and that we whipped up on our website right away. We had a press conference and so forth, because we wanted to be able to talk to the community and say, here's the things that need to happen now. Our city's been letting this slide way too long. They haven't done what they need to do. Here's the things that the city and the state can be doing right now. And so, we got busy and we have stayed busy pretty much ever since. I'm getting a little more sleep, but it's not ideal yet, right? Right. But it's still an extremely busy time. We're probably down to one protest a day, but it's still really, just an incredible amount of activity. And I think that's good, really. It means people care enough to want to step up and do something about this problem.
Sure. And we'll talk in a minute about that paper that you referenced with the 44 recommendations. Before we get there, I'm interested in your thoughts about, obviously, this issue came front and center this summer in our city. And as someone who's been involved in this now for a long time, I'm interested in what you perceive and what your organization perceives as kind of the few, 2 or 3, not that there's not more, but kind of the main issues with law enforcement in Minneapolis right now.
Well, I think the biggest issue, if you look at what's happened in this community and really all over the country, is accountability. Between the failures of badly designed civilian oversight bodies and qualified immunity and all of the other kinds of ways that police officers just kind of don't have to have any accountability for their conduct. And the city basically, well, particularly in Minneapolis, we're self-indemnified. So basically the city just pays people money to make the problem go away. And the problem never really does go away because they fail to rein in the cops. There also poor management within the police department causes the department to lose their arbitrations routinely. I think Minneapolis loses about 90 or so % of their arbitrations because they do a poor job of addressing discipline overall, and they do a poor job of documenting. So they keep losing all their arbitrations. So the few times they do try to discipline, it won't stick because their arbitration, their documentation and everything is so badly done. So we've got this huge problem with accountability. And of course, a strong union. Now, our organization does not have a problem with unions. And in fact, if you look at the Minneapolis police and St. Paul and the other police department, collective bargaining agreements, they're really not too far out of whack. I don't find that the collective bargaining agreement, there's some things that we ask for improvements on. We, have gone through and done a thorough review of the Minneapolis police collective bargaining agreement. And we've got like 14 recommendations for things like beefing up steroid testing after a critical incident and, reducing overtime and things like that. But really, those are not the problems, the collective bargaining agreements. It's more like just a lack of political will and poor systems to hold police accountable. The city talks a good game, but they're really not interested in actually, reining in the conduct of these police.
Sure. For those of us who might not be as knowledgeable, you referenced arbitrations and that the city loses often those arbitrations. I assume that what you're talking about is arbitrations trying to enforce discipline against officers. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
In your opinion, why are those arbitrations failing all the time?
Well, the biggest one is past practices. So what happens is, and I'll give you this is an instructional example. On his second day on the job, Chief Axtell, the St. Paul police chief, attempted to fire a man named Brett Palkowicz. Palkowicz was the officer that basically attacked a man named Frank Baker. Frank Baker was an African-American man who just pulled his car over because he was lost. He was looking for some directions, and he pulled his car over into a parking lot, didn't realize that there had been some report of a crime in that area, he was approached, and it was a crime that supposedly involved young people, like 20-year-olds. Frank Baker was a 50-something-year-old man. He gets out of his car. He's just sitting in his car. He's approached by an officer with a dog, and the officer makes him get out. The dog attacks him, and he's literally, oh, the video is so appalling to look at. They're literally, the dog is gnawing off the back of his leg, and it's twirling him around in a circle on the ground, and this man's gripping the circle, screaming, "Get the dog off me!" Oh, it's just appalling. And this man had committed no crimes whatsoever. And so then when the dog is not coming off, then the officer Palkowicz runs up and starts stomping on Frank Baker and fractures his ribs on both sides so that he literally had collapsed lungs on both sides. But for very good paramedical care, he would have died. And so then there was no basis for any of this conduct. Frank Baker won a $2 million lawsuit against the city of St. Paul, which was 2.5 years worth of their fund that they used for paying for, these kinds of liabilities. And the one officer, the dog officer, got disciplined, and he accepted his discipline. Palkowicz got fired. Axtell fired him, and he grieved his discipline, and it went to arbitration. The arbitrator reinstated Palkowicz because he said that there had been all these other incidents prior where no officer had been fired. And the interesting part about it is they cited 6 incidents where similar conduct had not resulted in termination, or in most cases, any discipline. And 4 of those 6 were Palkowicz. So when you have a past practice of not disciplining, you can't suddenly, 9 guys get away with something and then the 10th guy gets fired. You can't do that. So you have to, because you end up, they pull the past practice card out on you. So you've got to do this thing called the disciplinary reset. We taught Axtell how to do that disciplinary reset, where you sort of start the clock all over again. And we taught him how to do that. And once he started doing that, his arbitration started sticking. And that's an important thing, because when the arbitrations don't stick, that disempowers the police chief. So, it's a big problem.
Sure. And you referenced this disciplinary reset, and that's one of the things that I saw in this paper that you referenced with the 44 solutions, which I'll, for all the attendees, I'll put a link here in a minute down in the chat box that takes you to the paper by CUAPB. But one of those is a disciplinary reset. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. It's a process, and we've got a memo actually in the paper, so folks that are interested can reference that. It's a process in which the police chief basically, puts out a policy document that said, here's the new, whatever it is, use of force policy. That's usually where they attach it. Here's the new use of force policy. From this point forward, we are not going to rely on anything that we've done in the past. From this point forward, here's what here's the policy. Here's the disciplines for these different, for violating these different policies. So you need to also have a very good disciplinary matrix that outlines those disciplines and so forth. And, mitigating circumstances and all this kind of stuff. So you've got to have all that out there. And then you have to have everybody get trained on the policy. Your managers, meaning sergeants typically in the police department, have to get trained on how to document infractions in the policy and things like that. And then, everybody's going to sign off and say, yes, I get it. From now on, here's what's going to happen. And then once you've done that, then you have to absolutely thorough and consistent in your discipline. And you have to practice progressive discipline. You don't just wait, and the guy that's late for the 49th time, or whatever, suddenly fire the guy. You should have been coaching, then, verbal advisement, written advisement, suspension, termination, go through the process. And that way you are able to actually get your disciplines to stick.
And why do you feel like, in your experience, those policies in terms of establishing some standards for discipline hasn't been followed up to this point?
I'm sorry, you faded off there and I didn't quite hear the end of your question.
Sure. Why do you think that you referenced this disciplinary reset, in that making sure that the standards are followed consistently for all the different officers? And I'm wondering about your opinion as to why that hasn't happened yet.
Well, some of it's political, frankly. Policing is an interesting field because it is very political. And one of the things, I've been saying for years, just on sort of anecdotal information, that we believe that Black officers, for example, are disciplined more harshly than white officers. And I'd seen a lot of evidence of it, but there's not any good way, because you can't know in policing, because that personnel data is protected in certain ways. You can't know when somebody isn't disciplined, only when they are. And it's difficult to know, how many times that the person wasn't disciplined until they were, all of these kinds of things like that, because of the nature of police work. And, public employees have certain, privacy rights to personnel data. And so it was always kind of our gut feeling that cops were, that there was sort of disparate discipline that was happening by race, maybe by whether the person's liked more than others or whatever. It was always hard to figure this stuff out. A new study just came out that shows that, in fact, officers of color are more harshly disciplined than white officers. And so it's one of the pieces of this whole disciplinary reset matter. Sorry, I've got a cat that likes to come in when I'm on phone calls. My apologies. At any rate, this is one of the issues that comes up, is that there's a lot of disparate treatment of the officers, kind of depending on if there's somebody's favorite or not, and that kind of stuff, because it is very political. And that leads to uneven outcomes and lots of grievances by the cops, which some of those grievances are quite reasonable. And so, we're not saying like beat down all the cops. We're saying that we should have expectations about their conduct, and that those expectations should be across the board. And when officers engage in conduct that harms the community, there needs to be, consequences for that. And so what we're trying to do is set up a mechanism where those consequences can actually happen.
One of the other sort of recommendations or solutions that your organization has put forward with respect to, and I think specifically tied to this idea of accountability for police officers, that I haven't seen other organizations talk about in my experience, is this idea of having officers have personal liability insurance, which as lawyers, we know about from a malpractice insurance standpoint, but I hadn't seen that for police officers or law enforcement. Can you explain why you and your organization think that that's an important piece of accountability for police officers?
Absolutely. We actually dreamt up the idea. It was one of our supporters came up with that idea, and we did a lot of research into it. We've actually been working on this concept for about 8 or so years now, and we did a ton of research into it. We met with a lot of professionals, actuaries, and labor lawyers, and all kinds of professionals in the field to look at this question of professional liability. And that I've been a nurse for 40 years, and so I know, that I carry professional liability insurance. Lawyers certainly carry it. Even teachers and hairdressers and people like that have professional liability insurance. And the question for us is, why don't cops? In Minneapolis, the city is self-indemnified for police conduct incidents. And so we actually budget for all of the city's kind of liability. That we budget like 20 million, 21 million or so a year. And that's a pretty big chunk of change, for those of us who are homeowners in the Twin Cities. It can be, it's a little bit of money. And so our thought was that, and right now what happens is, a cop gets sued, they go to court, we lose, the city pays, which actually means we pay. So, and then the cop goes right back to the job. There's no discipline, no consequences, everybody moves on. Well, that's not really an okay way to do things. So we thought, how do we have the influence to affect police behavior? So this idea of professional liability insurance, the way we fleshed it out for the city is the city would pay the base rate for the policy. Any overages to that policy because of officer conduct would come out of an officer's pocket, giving them a huge incentive not to engage in that conduct, and a consequence if they did. Some officers would eventually become uninsurable. Like, for example, Bob Cole, the Police Federation president, I think that guy would really actually be uninsurable. He's had like 11 successful lawsuits against him, about 54 complaints from members of the community. I mean, if I was an insurer, he'd be a big red flag for me. I'll put it that way. So we think some of these officers, would become uninsurable, and then we could, get rid of them. Since the city seems to have no political will to make these guys move on, this would be a great way to get an kind of an apolitical insurer who's only worried about their bottom line to address the problem that we don't have the political will to address.
Yeah, and it's an interesting concept because it's something that we see in our business as an employment litigator and a plaintiff's employment litigator is oftentimes businesses have insurance to cover them to pay for, we do discrimination type work. And once you've been sued and potentially either settled or had a verdict against you, it's much harder to get that insurance. And so if you are then take the risk on to open another business, you could personally be liable. And that's kind of what you're talking about, right, in the police context.
Exactly. And, the other thing too is it's like these officers, we don't seem, again, to have the political will to rein them in. I'd like to see them have to own some of the risk of their own conduct. I think that that's not wrong. Especially for cities that are self-indemnified. Interestingly, we were not able to get this on the ballot in Minneapolis, even though we collected, almost 20,000 signatures to do it. We were not able to get it on the ballot in Minneapolis for some different technical reasons, but it actually is being taken up and it's going to happen in New York State. So we're really excited. We've actually worked with folks all over the country. There are people in Las Vegas working on this, Florida, Ohio. We've got a bunch of places, and New York is probably going to become the first state that has this. And if you think about it, it's a little bit like auto insurance. Back when people started, when Henry Ford made the car, they didn't have auto insurance, right? But eventually it became a thing. And we think that this will become a thing at a point.
And just like bad drivers who can't get insurance, they hopefully shouldn't be driving. That's the hope with police officers, right? That's
exactly it. They shouldn't be, if they can't, abide by the Constitution and control their own behavior, maybe they shouldn't be police officers. Yeah.
One of the other recommendations, and I put the link down in the chat box for anybody who's interested to take a look at the 44 recommendations from CUAPB. But one of the other ones that I think a lot of people have talked about in the city, and I've seen a lot of news stories since this summer, was civilian oversight. And we have a couple organizations that exist in the city right now, the OPCR, the PCOC committee. There's a couple in St. Paul. What's the CUAPB's position on civilian oversight, and what needs to kind of change to have more teeth to it?
Well, if we had real civilian oversight, that'd be great. So that's our position. I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit hurt, but basically, what happened is we used to have a civilian review authority. They did never have enough authority, so they were always lacking what they needed to actually do the job, and they were deeply under-resourced. They had 2 investigators, hardly any support staff. I mean, they really were deeply under-resourced and kept that way on purpose. And at one point, Mayor R.T. Ryback, ways back, actually defunded them completely, even though there was a city ordinance that required us to have a civilian oversight body. He defunded them, and then they just became defunct for like a year and a half to 2 years. And, there was no place to have complaints go. And so this is problematic, obviously. So then kind of as they struggled along, eventually the city decided even that was too much, because they actually had a pretty good sustain rate for a while there. The average sustain rate for civilian oversight bodies is nationally is 7 to 8%. And I think that's on the low side, but that's what it is on average nationally.
And what you're referring to there is
what's that?
Referring to there is the sustain rate for police officer discipline.
Yes, exactly. So we had at one point almost a 15% sustain rate, our civilian review authority, despite being so under-resourced, and then they for some reason the city decided that was too much, that the cops didn't like it. They literally said, police don't like it, so we're going to get rid of it. And so what they did was they replaced it with the Office of Police Conduct Review, which is not civilian oversight, even though they pretend it is. It's controlled at every level by city staff and police. And so it's not civilian oversight. And and you could know it's not, because here's the statistic for you. They, in the last 8 years that they've been in operation, they have sustained and disciplined 13 complaints from members of the community in 8 years. That is a 0.42% sustained discipline rate. 0.42, less than half of 1%, when the national average is 7 to 8%. So we're like the low end outlier for the whole country. So if you want to know if we're, actually holding cops accountable, there's your answer. It's a resounding no. That body is a resounding failure. And the sad part to me is that we have been going to the city council year in and year out, telling them how bad that body was, what a terrible job they were doing. And yet, the city council was, ho-hum, wasn't paying attention, couldn't get them to take police accountability seriously until George Floyd got killed. And even now, it's like they're trying to put the genie back in the bottle. We haven't seen them do any of the things that they could be doing to address police accountability. If it was me and I was a city leader, I would have jumped on several things that I could have done quickly to address this problem. And what we see instead is them not even wanting to have the conversation. So it's pretty frustrating.
What's the recommendation from CUAPB regarding, how would your organization like to see civilian oversight work for police officers and officer discipline?
Well, here's an interesting part that most people don't realize. Our city charter assigns the oversight of police, including their discipline, to our mayor. The mayor has traditionally delegated that to the police chief, but could delegate that to a body of community members, a group of lawyers. I don't know, something outside of the city's control would be our preference. We like the general concept of community oversight of the police. It has to be, it has to be fleshed out more, but we like the general concept. And we also like, as I said, taking that realm of police discipline outside of the kind of the grip of the city. They just haven't had the willpower to do it and haven't dedicated the appropriate resources and so forth.
What about obviously there was a lot of discussion after George Floyd's killing this summer about the charter amendment and creating a public safety department that was overseen by the city council as opposed to the mayor. Do you see that as a potential solution?
We didn't like it. We did not support it. There were two parts to that city charter, a proposed charter amendment. It was, first of all, it was badly written. It was badly written to the point that it had fatal flaws in it. For example, when you write a city charter, you got to decide, and it's related to a department, you've got to decide who's going to be responsible for hiring the head of the department, who oversees these different functions and things like that. And one of the functions that they failed to assign to anybody was discipline for the police officers. So, you can't have a department that doesn't have any way to discipline the employees, and that kind of thing. And so that was a fatal flaw. And so that part, and we also did not like the idea of police and their accountability being stuck under a department that reports to a city council committee that then reports to the whole city council. It's bad enough now that we couldn't even get them to pay attention to the OPCR, which they are over, the council is responsible for the OPCR. And since they ignored it for 8 years, we just didn't think that they would do a good job with the whole police department. So that was one of our concerns. But the part that we did like was that it would have removed the minimum funding requirement from the city charter. Many people don't realize that for years, like since I think the 70s or thereabouts, there's been a requirement in the charter that there be a minimum funding for police. And it's at 0.0017 times the population. So for us right now, I think that comes out to about 730 or so employees, not officers, not sworn officers, employees. And we've never gotten anywhere near close to that number. Right now, we are sitting, I think, at 880, almost 900 employees in the department. When this whole thing started, we were at over 1,000. So we've never been close to running into that problem. But by getting rid of that, we would have more flexibility about how we use the resources of the city. So our organization's position is, everybody's talking about defunding and dismantling and all that, and nobody really knows what those words mean. So what we've tried to do is really define what we're talking about. And what we're talking about is downsizing the police department, redirecting those resources to more appropriate responders for the kinds of things like mental health crisis calls, drug overdoses, homelessness, welfare, wellness checks, those kinds of things that don't actually require a police officer, but instead, social workers, mental health workers, people like that. So let's take police out of the realm of things that don't need a law enforcement lens. Redirect those funds to more appropriate responders for those kinds of things. And then for the cops we have left, rein them in, really, really rein them in appropriately, address the discipline issues, change the culture of that police department, and then I think we'd be okay with things. We weren't actually in favor of outright abolishing the police, at least not at this time, because we do also have a problem with crime in the streets, and people don't want to have to make a choice between street crime and police crime. So that's been our organization's position.
And you have, speaking to that, one of the things we were talking about yesterday as we were preparing was a recent paper that your organization put out about having alternative responders outside of police officers respond to non-violent situations. And can you explain a little bit more about why your organization feels like that's an adequate change and redirection of funds away from police to these, potential other organizations?
Yes. In a 3-week period between November and December of 2018, 5 people in the state of Minnesota were killed by law enforcement while they were in the throes of mental health crisis. One of those was a man named Travis Jordan in the north side of Minneapolis. And something about those 5 cases in rapid fire. I mean, I'd always known that the way that police handle mental health calls was problematic, but those 5 cases just got my attention. Really, really called me into action and called our group into action. What we saw in the Travis Jordan case, for example, was these officers, 2 rookie cops that were sent out to deal with a man who was suicidal in his house with a knife. So he's in his house and he had an edged weapon, and the response to an edged weapon, or the defense against an edged weapon, is distance and barriers. Well, there's no better barrier than the walls of your house. But instead of letting the man just be in his house and just talking to him, the officer, one in particular, kept going to the window and saying, "Get your behind," and he was using the A word, obviously, but, trying to be nice here, he was like, "Get, beat out, get the F out of your house," and all of this stuff like that, and demanding this guy come out of his house and agitating him. He's screaming at him through the window. And finally, when the man emerges out the front door, he takes one step on his porch because they tell him to, and they gun him down, and he's dead. This was appalling to us. And so from that, we formed a work group, and we spent 1.5 years working on a paper that addresses ending police-only responses to mental health crisis calls. Clearly, police are not the right responders. They never were. They didn't go to school to understand how to assess mental illness, and all of those kinds of things. And even the little trainings that have happened, like CIT and all of this, have not prepared police officers adequately to address mental illness in the field. What we want to see happen is for the vast majority of these calls to be able to send a team of mental health professionals, not outreach workers, but actual mental health professionals, to the scene to do an immediate assessment, determine if the person can be cared for at home, if they need to be transported, all that kind of stuff. And then for those few cases where there may be some element of risk, then we would send a team, a co-responder team of an officer and a mental health worker. But really, you don't say, "Gosh, my car's broken down, I'll call the dog catcher." My house is on fire, let me bring in, the doctor. You know what I mean? It's like you want the right responder to the right situation, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Okay. We have a question that came in, which I think goes to one of the things in some of our discussion as we were preparing about, independent prosecutors, and you referenced yesterday how the Minneapolis Civil Rights Department works. But here's the question that was posed to you. The Minneapolis City Attorney's Office, which defends police misconduct lawsuits and also prosecutes criminal cases, provides legal advice to the Civil Rights Department department, including the police oversight groups. Do you see that as a conflict of interest, and how would you recommend we change it?
Oh, yes. And I think the person that wrote the question knows it is also, I'm pretty sure that they were definitely, understanding that. I don't know if it makes sense to hire outside attorneys to advise those committees, but I definitely see this as a huge issue. One of the reasons it's an issue is because in the city attorney's office over the years, any firewall that existed between the civil and the criminal side has really disintegrated. We've been talking about this for years and years now, that there used to be a pretty clear firewall. So for example, when people would go to the Civilian Review Authority to make a complaint, no one from the city's attorney's office was allowed to come in there and look at those complaints. They weren't allowed to have anything to do with the complaints that came into the CRA. Now, routinely, the city attorney's office reviews complaints that come into the Office of Police Conduct Review. And, it's so bad that, first of all, the OPCR has to give people a warning that that any complaint they make, that if the complaint is not found to have merit, that person could be prosecuted for having brought the complaint. So that's under 609.505. That's a god-awful statute. Go look it up sometime. That's like something I've been fighting for years to try to get rid of that statute. It's so bad I know the number off the top of my head, right? So that's one of the issues. But also, like I said, the city attorney's office farms those complaints routinely to look for things that they can prosecute the person for, or to bolster prosecution that's already in existence. One of the things that we know from all the thousands of hotline calls that we've dealt with over the years is this: virtually everybody that gets brutalized by the cops is going to have some kind of a charge put on them. We call them cop charges or cover charges. It's almost always obstructing legal process, disorderly conduct, and or fourth degree assault against a police officer. It's routine that these folks get these charges. And so when somebody comes to us and they say, I've got a charge, and we say, let us guess, OLP, which is obstructing legal process in our language, that kind of stuff. It's just routine that they get these charges. And so the way that the lack of the firewall and the way that the city attorney's office makes use of those complaints is frankly atrocious. It shouldn't be existing.
And you brought up the point about, I think what the term you used were cover charges to some extent. And one of the things I read in preparation was some comments on your website and some other articles regarding this case, a Supreme Court case, actually, Heck versus Humphrey.
Yes.
And can you explain how that case impacts the idea of what you're referencing for these cover charges?
Absolutely. It feels funny to me to explain things to lawyers, because I know you guys probably know way more than I do. But what we've known for a long time, of course, is that under the Supreme Court decision, Heck versus Humphrey, which kind of created that Heck doctrine, essentially, if a person goes down on criminal charges, they lose the ability to have a civil suit except for possibly excessive force. That might stay on the table, but any kind of 1983 civil claims that they might have, they're gone. So one of the main ways that police cover for what they've done is by putting a whole bunch of charges on the person. Again, usually, obstructing legal process or disorderly conduct, but sometimes fourth degree assault against the officer. And I have seen cases where it is literally, the person's charged with fourth degree assault because their head hit the cop's fist. I mean, it's like that kind of ridiculous. The cop's got like a little red pink spot on his little knuckle or something like that. And this person's like, got a concussion and gashes in their head and broken teeth and all this. And they're the one getting charged. So we see this a lot, actually. This happened. I mean, this is routine in our work. It happened a lot to people that got harmed by police in the Metro Gang Strike Force. The people that got beat up by the cops routinely got charged with fourth degree assault to cover what they did.
Interesting. So we have another question, which I think also goes to something that I've seen in your articles regarding residency requirements. And so the question is, do you think it's an issue that police officers are not required to live in the cities or communities in which they work?
Actually, it doesn't even matter what I think. What the studies show, and this is something I haven't mentioned before, and I'll tell you now. We're a very evidence-based group. We are about we like things that are evidence-based. We like stuff that's got some background to it. For example, when we were doing the police insurance amendment, there are tons of academic studies that show the impact of professional liability insurance on police conduct. And so we felt very confident that what we were recommending was actually going to work. And so we look to the evidence on this question of residency, and there's not a shred of evidence, not one single study that shows that residency, either requirements or incentives, do anything to reduce police, incidents or lower the incidence of excessive force or anything like that. In fact, there's a few studies that show that where residency requirements exist, or or incentives exist, people in the communities trust the cops less. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I think just from anecdotally, what we see in the field is this, because we take cases from all over the state. What we see is that, sheriff deputies out in outstate areas are more than happy to beat up their neighbors. Thank you very much. And, they live in the same neighborhoods typically. So we don't see that as any real sort of recommendation.
One of the other questions that I had as we were talking through these issues yesterday and also reading through some of the materials is that I often hear in these discussions that I've heard this summer after the George Floyd killing was a response from people just saying, well, you don't care about people who are victims of crimes, and you're just outwardly not supporting the police at all. What would you say in response to those people who take that position?
Well, first of all, our organization cares about anything that harms the community. So of course we care about those things. What I try to point out to people though is that police brutality and misconduct, these are crimes also. There's a whole army of people who get paid to address, sort of street crime, the kinds of stuff like community crime that happens. There's no one that's actually getting paid, including us for that matter, to address police crime. There's no one actually really taking on that particular element. And so it's not like one or the other, like, oh, if you get rid of police brutality, then you'll have all this crime in the streets or whatever. We don't need police brutality to address crime in the streets. Police can address crime while acting constitutionally, while, upholding people's rights, while avoiding excessive force. They actually can address crime in those ways. The other thing is this: people have to recognize that police do not stop crime. They are reactive to crime. They are after the fact. They address crime after the fact. So they do investigations and things like that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we aren't against or aren't in favor of outright abolishment of the police at this time, because if there is crime going on, the way that people who are harmed by violent crime or, financial exploitation or whatever the case may be, the way that they can access the court system is by way of a law enforcement investigation. And until that changes, we really can't, abolish police, at least, at this time, given the way that our society is structured. Maybe that might be something for the future, but at this point, we don't think that that's possible. So, but again, we don't think people should have to choose between street crime and police crime, and I'll throw out kind of one more thing, and maybe this will be a little controversial, but there's like a whole class of crime that never gets addressed by anybody. And that's some of the crime that happens behind the glass windows and the pretty doors and all of this stuff of the very big buildings that exist in downtowns all over the country. I'm talking about like financial exploitation, banksters stealing people's houses and things like that. And, those are harms to the community as well. And I don't see people going, gosh, if you stop the cops from beating people, then there'll be more houses getting stolen or whatever. We don't see people talking like that. It's kind of crazy talk. You shouldn't have to choose between one or the other. That's the bottom line.
Great. One of the last questions I have for you, we just have a couple minutes left here, is for all those in attendance, as we're thinking about these issues, and hopefully people jump onto our additional conversation series with our other speakers in the next couple months. But from your position, what can people do to get involved and become more knowledgeable about this issue, whether that's assisting with CUAPB in your work or otherwise? What would be your recommendations?
Well, that's a great question. And I hope everybody wants to get involved in something that benefits your community, whether it be dealing with police accountability or other issues. Certainly police accountability and reining it in will save you some tax dollars. So maybe that'd be a big incentive to get involved. But, you know, people can get involved with our organization or with any of the organizations in town. I'm not, sectarian about it, so to speak, or whatever, I'm agnostic. Just get involved with somebody, right? And do something. There's lots of ways that you could, lawyers, for example, I think could be teaching know your rights classes to make sure the community understands their rights in the legal system. You can be getting involved in litigation. We do a ton of litigation, and, we're always looking for volunteer lawyers to help us to do that litigation. You can be involved in taking up civil cases for people, watching what the city's working on. Right now, for example, they're reappointing people to the Police Conduct Oversight Commission, which is like the public face of the Office of Police Conduct Review. They're appointing people, and they've got 4 openings, and of the 4 openings, the 4 people that bring forward, 2 of them are involved in law enforcement, and we're like, whoa. So we've already been talking to the city council and telling them, you better open up this process, and what are you doing putting 2 cops in charge of, something that's supposed to be run by the community? There's all kinds of things that you've got to pay attention to all the time. I would say if you just want like work to do, things to take up, follow our Facebook page. We have a lot of little action items we put up all the time. Make a phone call, write a letter, send an email, little things that can be done all day long. We always say that we can, the work we do is controlled by the number of people we have to do it, because we're an all volunteer group. And so, plug in, and it doesn't have to be onerous and big. Just plug in and do something, plug in and find a spot.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we're towards the end of our time. I appreciate everyone jumping on, especially you, Michelle. Thanks for joining us and talking about your organization and also the work you've done for all attendees. I've put 2 articles from CUAPB in the notes section, the 44 recommendations for addressing police misconduct and police brutality in Minneapolis, and I think beyond, but also your recent paper about alternative responders, sort of diverting some of those funds and energy to other people who are responding in particular to mental health crisis. So we appreciate everybody jumping on today. We hope you'll attend our future events on November 20th and December 1st with other individuals involved in this topic, and we hope that it's useful. And thanks again, everybody, and special thanks to you, Michelle, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me today. Really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.